a little bit of an idea what's going to go on today. We're going to start with just some brief introductions because there are some new faces here, some old faces, which is great, and some new faces. So my name is Jess Madosky, and I am a professor at Wilson College and also the chair of the CAG board. And then let's go with, I'm just going to introduce the board members and the important parties that are here today. So if you want to...
Hi, I'm Vicki Collins. I'm retired from Warren Wilson, and I'm the researcher. Because I'm a chemist.
Yeah, Bill McCollum, and I'm the EPA and Diener Liaison on the CAG board.
Laura Ellenberg, treasurer, very little.
We're talking about that today, though.
I'm William Anthony, I'm the vice chair, and I'm glad Jess is really healthy.
And I'm Mark Santos, the outreach coordinator and public communications officer. So happy for all you to be here.
And I'm Amy Nisley, I'm the secretary to the board. If you are a member of the community advisory group, could you please sign in? Because we do keep track of your being here. And if you are here and haven't been receiving emails from us, that means you're not on our contact list. And if you would like to be, please add yourself to it. And we will occasionally send you a meeting notice.
All right, and we have some very special guests here to talk to us today. So if you guys mind introducing yourselves, starting with Stephen.
Sure. I'm Ryman. I'm the project coordinator. I work for the companies who are responsible for cleaning up the site.
I'm Rob Fox. I'm an environmental lawyer, and I represent Chemtronics.
And I'm Harry Morris. I'm with TRC, also representing the consultant for Chemtronics.
John, do you want to introduce yourself?
I'm John Bonham. I'm the regional project manager for EPA for the Chemtronics site.
Okay.
Marshall Benford, I'm the EPA site attorney.
Oh, great.
Okay.
Good to have you here. I'm Beth.
Oh, did you?
We can hear you.
Oh, sure. I'm Marshall Benford, and I'm with EPA too. And I'm the site attorney.
Okay.
And I'm Beth Bartzel, I'm with Diener, NC Diener, so I'm with the state.
Great, so we have a lot of important people here today, and so I want to go over just really briefly our agenda for today. We're going to do some CAG business, short update on what's going on at the site from Bill. We're going to talk a little bit about budget / fundraising, as Laura sort of alluded to. And then we're going to actually move into a presentation on what's going on with the site and some of the property boundary redefinition sort of issues that are going on. There will be a period for question and answer. Just so everybody knows, there was a period of time where you could submit questions to the CAG website. I have those questions. We'll start with those questions if they haven't been answered already. So we'll start with those questions, and then we'll move into an open question and answer session. And we do request that everybody come to it in good faith and with the spirit of, trying to communicate and gather information. So obviously trying to allow everybody the chance to speak and have the opportunity to ask questions, and trying to keep it civil and professional, of course. So why don't we start with Bill?
Yes, I'll keep it very brief. Gave an update at the last meeting and talked about the work that's going on to review the draft remedial investigation report. That's still ongoing. And then the other thing that we talked about, that I'm sure there'll be some discussion tonight, is the boundary change request. At the last meeting, we discussed the fact that there'd been a change request submitted, and we didn't have a lot of information about the specifics on that other than a map that we showed with the current boundary, proposed boundary, and so we'll be hearing more about that. Those are the two big issues underway that we're tracking right now. And John, I wanted to give you an opportunity if you wanted to talk about anything as far as progress that EPA may have made on either of those.
Keep it brief. Just for everybody's information, if you really would like a copy of the draft RI, there's a bunch of copies back there on CDs. Feel free to take one. It's a hefty document. If you haven't signed yet, I will cure you. Tanya Whitsett is no longer the community involvement coordinator for Chemtronics. Angela Miller, who is also the community coordinator for CTS, has been assigned to be the community Superfund coordinator for Chemtronics.
That was
Angela
Angela Miller.
Miller. Our risk assessor and the consultant who prepared risk assessment as part of the remedial investigation met last week or this week, and they have kind of come together. So I'm anticipating that EPA will complete a review of the draft RI sometime in January of next year. So then we'll move forward with finalizing that document sometime after that. So somewhere between now and January, I'll be back up here, hopefully if I get invited to at least make a presentation showing you what the conclusions of the RI are. So, but, and you know, we all got furloughed. Well, we got furloughed for quite a few weeks, 2 weeks or so kind of backed up, but I will be sending a number of documents to Bill that have come through EPA along with our comments on those documents, so he will include those on your website.
Those are draft
Basically ongoing work for the treatability studies, plant studies that are ongoing.
Great, thank you. So I want to give an update on the budget from our last board meeting. So we talked, and this was some information that Laura had given us earlier, that we're probably looking at needing about $400 to get started with incorporation and 501c3 status, nonprofit status essentially, which is something we do want to move forward on as a board. And so we have some ideas. There were some suggestions made for fundraising. Asking for contributions from the members was a first easy suggestion. Also looking at potentially doing a silent auction, which I've had a lot of experience doing as a fundraiser in other organizations. Setting up a booth or table at the Christmas craft fair that happens at the middle school. Doing some crowdsourced internet-based fundraising. You may have heard of Kickstarter, things of those nature. And potentially doing benefit at local eateries, where a percentage of the profits for that day would go towards supporting the CAG. So we are thinking about those sorts of ideas. Because we are having the PRP representatives from the PRPs and the EPA here today, we are not going to discuss fundraising very much today because we have other important business that we need to cover. But I am going to send around a sign-up list. If anybody wants to volunteer for the fundraising committee, would like to help with these sort of issues, we'd love to have you. So we're now getting into the point of having some committees. So we hope that members and non-members will be encouraged to sign up for these committees. So on one side, it's the volunteering for the fundraising committee. On the other side, it's a volunteer form for volunteering for the public outreach committee. Do you want to say a few words about that, Mark?
So yeah, we're looking to build a little committee for the public outreach kind of section of the CAG. We're hoping to get more actual physical flyers, beef up our sort of online presence, and really get word of mouth and try to get some good input from our local community members. So I realize there's at least a couple of newcomers. Thank you so much for coming. And just hoping that thank you.
Does anybody have any quick questions about either committees or fundraising?
Just a suggestion, how easy it is to become a member of the CAG if you're here and are not a member. Go to the website and complete the form, and it's
And send it to the board.
just a breeze.
Yep. All right, so I'm going to send this around. The board probably doesn't want to sign up for the committee more than we already are, but so if you want to sign up, we'd be happy to have you. Now, I think we're going to segue into an opportunity for a presentation. So for some information from the Chemtronics representatives. So take it away. Thank you for being here. Okay.
So once again, my name is Rob Fox. I'm an environmental lawyer by training, and I'm representing Chemtronics, who's the owner of the site, the current owner of the site. I have with me Harry Myers. Harry's a hydrogeologist, and he works for TRC, who's an environmental consulting firm who works on behalf of Chemtronics as well. First of all, I wanted to thank you all for the opportunity to come in here and make this presentation. I think total will take about a half an hour. Hopefully I'll try to keep this to 5 minutes, and then Harry will go through some of the details on this. And we're here to answer questions, so when we get done, We got tonight a list of questions that were sent in advance. Thankfully, I would say about 90% of them we had intended to cover anyway. There's a couple questions that we had not, but we'll answer them to the best of our ability at the end as well. And then if there's any other questions you have, feel free to ask us. I'm going to talk really briefly about the who and the why, and Harry's going to talk about the what, where, and how of what this site redefinition is. So the who, as you know, there's three parties who are responsible for doing the remediation at this property. They were, at one time or another, the owners and operators of this facility. So we have Celanese, Northrop Grumman, and Chemtronics, who is the current owner. That's the who. While it's Chemtronics property now, this submission that we made to EPA and DENR is something that all three of the parties support. So I guess the most important question to start with is why? Why are we trying to redefine the boundaries of the site? And I wanted to give you a little bit of background about, and Harry will do this in a lot more detail, but just to frame this, a little bit of background about how the site was originally come to be, the shape that it is, and then what our purpose is in terms of the redefinition. So it's about 1,065 acres, the site. And the reason it was 1,065 acres, believe it or not, way back when in the 80s, was for no other reason than the site was defined by the property boundaries, meaning literally the meets and bounds tax boundaries of this property. There was very little thought put into which portion of the site was actually impacted. It was just easier rather than drawing some squiggly line on the map at the time to say these are the property boundaries, we're going to call it the Chemtronics Superfund site. And that's how the site was originally defined, by those property boundaries, which, as I said, was a little bit over 1,065 acres. Harry's going to go into more detail on this, but over the course of the last probably now 28 years, there's been a lot of work out at the site, detailed investigation, which has really refined and defined the areas of the site that were ever used and that were ever impacted, either the soil on the property or the groundwater on the property. And so we believe that it's appropriate to redefine the site to those areas which are actually impacted, plus a very healthy buffer around that area. And that's what the basis of our site redefinition proposal is to include the areas of the site that are actually impacted based upon this extensive study, plus a buffer, and we call that the redefined site, and then to exclude an area of the site that has never been impacted, based upon, Harry will go through the whole process of how we came up with that, and we call that the excluded area. So when you hear those terms tonight, that's what we're talking about. The redefined site is all the areas that have any impact of any sort historically or currently, plus a buffer, and the excluded area are areas of the site which have no impacts at all. And it basically split the site in half in terms of acreage. I'll give you the exact numbers, but it's about half and half, about 500 acres and 500 acres. So what's our goal with respect to this excluded area? The goal is really twofold, and I can tell you that as the representative of the site owner, these are goals that they're not going to deviate from. One is that they want to keep the excluded area in the condition it is now, meaning it's a beautiful forested area and they want to maintain that as a nice forested area. And the second thing is they don't want anything to happen on that portion of the property that would in any way negatively impact the remediation that needs to be done on the redefined site. So those are the two goals in terms of how we went about this process. Harry will go into detail in terms of how he defined the excluded area, but I wanted you to understand what those two goals are. There's been a lot of questions, and I wanted to address this at the beginning in terms of what the plans are for the excluded area and the redefined area. And as I said, when you have a goal of preserving the excluded area, we're proposing to do a couple things. One is to put a deed restriction on the property that it can never be used for residential purposes. The second is to put a deed restriction on that excluded area so that you can never use the groundwater on that property for potable purposes. And there will be no groundwater usage on that portion of the property that will have any impact on the portion of the property which is going to be subject to remediation. The long-term plan for the excluded area is to do some type of sustainable forestry for that. If we get to the point where EPA agrees to exclude this portion of the property, we've already contacted 3 or 4 local forestry consultants. We would have them go out and make proposals to us to do an inventory of the timber on that property. And I think the thought would be, based upon their expertise, a very low intensity use, which would essentially take down the older dying timber, sell it to pay the property taxes, and then to plant new trees so that we have a sustainable forest on that property in perpetuity. That's the goal for the excluded area. On the redefined site, again, the company is willing to put a deed restriction on the redefined site so it would never be used for residential purposes. They would put a deed restriction on the property again so that groundwater on the property would never be used for potable purposes. And by the way, on both of these parcels, it's important to do that so that you're not creating any potential risk that anybody could be exposed to that on-site area. So that's the second thing. In terms of the company's plans for the reuse of the remediation parcel, the redefined site, I can say that they have no current plans to reuse the property at all. Certainly not until the property is remediated and the property is in its operation and maintenance phase. They just don't want anything to impact the proper remediation of the parcel. So I think thoughts about what could be done in the future, to be honest with you, it's a little early for that. And that probably will not happen for quite some time until after the remedy is selected, the remedy is implemented and is stable. And at that point, it will not be residential, but at that point, use of the property could be considered. But that's down the road quite a way, to be quite honest with you. So that's basically what the overall approach for this is. I think we submitted this proposal to EPA and DENR in June. They have been reviewing it. We wanted to come to your group and talk to you because obviously you live in this community, and we wanted to get your input about not only the process and what we've come up with, but our ideas with respect to the low intensity use on the property before we went forward. And that really is the purpose of tonight's meeting. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Harry. Harry will give you the nuts and bolts technical, how they came up with the acreage and that was excluded and part of the redefined site.
All right. Thank you, Rob. And again, thank you for the opportunity to be here tonight. As Rob said, I'm a hydrogeologist. I've been working on the project for about a year, and the benefit of that is I've had the ability to bring a pair of fresh eyes in reading all of these reports, and that's what I'll talk to you tonight. You'll see in the presentation. There's been a wealth of, Rob said there was 28 years of investigation performed on the site. There's been many different environmental consultants that have studied this. I'm sure that if you've looked at the public repository, there's reams and reams of documents that have been prepared, and all of that information. Why that's important to you is there's been a lot of very good study and a lot of very good work characterizing the site and defining what is out there. So if you've already seen a map, I thought I would start the presentation with the conclusion, right? And perhaps you've already seen it, but I'll try not to get in your way.
Would it be helpful if we turn up the light because there's some actual color on that so you can see the boundaries? Maybe better able to see it.
Okay. All right. So Rob talked about the site. It's a big piece of property. It's over 1,000 acres, and that's what is in yellow. So a few things that I want to, particular areas, there's the back valley, we refer to it, and the front valley. And the purple boundary here is the proposed redefined site. And so you'll see along this boundary, this is along Beetree Creek, we're not changing that property boundary at all. But in this upland areas, there's a lot of area that was never used in operations of the plant. It was never impacted, it was never affected. And so I'll kind of go through that a little bit. But so that's, the purple boundary is the redefined boundary. There's this, it's hard to see, there's a green line right there, that's a ridge line that separates the back valley from the front valley. And you can see there's some tributaries, some creeks, streams that come down out of these valleys that drain the valley, and they then converge and flow into Beetree Creek. Okay? So then just to better illustrate that, the yellow then is what we're referring to as the excluded area, and then the green area would be the new CERCLA or Superfund site as it is redefined. So it's a brief presentation. I have, we'll talk about the objective. I guess Rob already covered that. The objective of the site redefinition, the basis for the existing site definition, the basis for how we went through and identified the areas that were affected by the previous site use, and then just concluding with what is the proposed boundary. So the steps were, again, to just identify those portions of the site that were affected by chemicals, manufacturing operations, or in any way had a negative impact on the property in the way of a chemical or chemical constituent. And we want to make sure that we retain those within the redefined boundary, so that, and that will then be subject to the ongoing remediation. And then also, separate from that, identify all those areas that have not been impacted and don't need to be part of the ongoing Superfund site. So a little bit of history. In 1983, the site was first listed on what's known as the National Priorities List, the NPL, which made the site a Superfund site or a CERCLA site. As Rob said, the site at that time was defined solely by its boundaries. And in the original listing, EPA even acknowledges that a very small portion of the overall site is actually impacted. But just to be protective at that time, they didn't have good knowledge at the time of all the work hadn't been done. They just went ahead and listed the whole piece of property. And then why we're here now at this particular juncture is we're at the point in the project where we're completing the remedial investigation, RI report. And so that document will conclude all of the investigation that's necessary. And you can't fix a problem until you really know what you have. And that's where we are now. We're at the point where we know what we have, we've defined the site, we know where the problems exist within the soil and the surface water and the groundwater. And so now we're ready to move on to the next phase to begin to get after remediating it. And there's been ongoing work already in the form of pilot studies. So the basis for the site redefinition, originally back in the 80s and the 2000s, somebody said in the aughts, I heard, but it's in the aughts, the early 2000 decade, decade, there were employee interviews that were conducted. And there were also multiple events where they studied all of the historical records, any documents that were available from the site manufacturing operations. There were people that went through those, that studied those with the purpose of identifying where are all the areas that we should investigate. So we utilized that information in this analysis. We also utilized In 1985, EPA performed their own photographic interpretation where they gathered any and all documents that they could find in the aerial photographs and studied those and produced a report kind of documenting where the site operations, where the operational areas existed. So we reviewed that report. Then subsequent to that began the 28 years worth of investigations. And literally there's dozens and dozens of reports where a number of different consulting companies along the way, including Altamont, have studied the property. So, and I'll show you in a moment here some of the main reports that we depended on. Also, EPA has, every step of the way in the state, has reviewed those reports and the work plans that were produced. And so they've been involved every step of the way, and those documents have been approved. And then lastly, what TRC, the company that I work for representing Chemtronics, in this effort, we were asked, please pour through all of the reports and arrive at what you think is a protective boundary that would include all of the areas that should be included. And what we did, after we did all of that work, was we did our own, with all of the internet nowadays, there's a lot more information that you can get your hands on in the way of images of the site. So we did an exhaustive study of topographic maps and aerial photographic images of the property, just to make our own interpretation about, is there something outside of the main areas that have been studied, is there something in the outer reaches of the property that would show up that maybe somebody missed, right? So we did that, and then identified some areas that were suspect, and we went out and did some reconnaissance. So I'll talk about that a little bit more. So this is just a glance at a dozen or more of the most significant reports. And these are very extensive. This last RI report alone is probably this thick. I kid you not. I mean, there's that much information in just that one last report. So there's been numerous studies that we went through to arrive at what I'm going to share with you here. And the main purpose of the investigations was to define the chemical constituents, right? Where are they? So to delineate those both horizontally and vertically. So I have some slides here that I'll show that have the historical buildings, where all the historical buildings were, where the former areas of investigation, all those areas that were identified in all of these reports. There's a comprehensive soil sampling map that I'll share. And then where are the specific areas where groundwater, if you look at all of the federal drinking water standards, the state standards, what are all the applicable standards that groundwater shouldn't exceed? We call that the applicable standards, if you just take a comprehensive listing. And we've identified all of the areas on the site where the groundwater exceeds any applicable standard. And so this is the first map, and you can see the redefined boundaries kind of cropped off here. That's because I've zoomed in on the front valley. Remember that there's the front valley and the back valley, just so you could kind of get a better view. The next slide will show the back valley. So this shows the white, these are the roadways that went through. This is the front gate. There's a back gate up here. So this shows the roadways, the network, and the former site-related buildings. You can see there were many buildings on the property. I mean, there's dozens of buildings, right? And there were also then, it's hard to differentiate on the slide but this is orange and that's yellow, but regardless, it shows all of the former areas of investigation as well. So there's little blips here that, for whatever reason, in pouring through the historical documents, right, they said there is a sump there, there is a, this was a hazardous waste area, where they may have stored drums or something. So they had identified all those. In addition, there's the, I'm pointing at the wrong thing, the disposal areas. So there's a disposal area here and a disposal area here. And those disposal areas, they'll show up both. There's 2 in the front valley and there's a few in the back valley. Those were dealt with in the 80s in the way of they went in and they covered them with a synthetic membrane, a cap, a plastic cap, and then covered that up with dirt, and then covered that up with good soil for growing vegetation, and then grew grass. So it's a vegetated, protected cap. It has a fence around it, and they cut the grass to maintain the cap to make sure that the cap is not disturbed. So I say all of that to say that this is from the former site-related buildings. This is a 500-foot setback that we just decided, just for added measure of safety, right, that let's go ahead and stay away from any of the former operational buildings and from any of the areas that were investigated. We've got a 500-foot setback on the west, and then to the north, it's, I'll show you that on the next slide. So here is the back valley. So the back valley, this is about a quarter of a mile that we're staying away from the disposal areas. So just to be very protective, we believe in the concept of using suspenders and a belt. We want to be extra overly conservative, that we've set the boundary in the back valley even further up the mountain. And here's why. So when you see, this is the potential areas of affected soil. So Altamont, in the process of doing the remedial investigation, they identified all of the areas. They put a grid on the site, so you can see the grid. The grid is, to give you an idea of scale, 250 feet by 250 feet. So each little cell is, whatever that is, an acre, right? And then they identified in the light gray all of the areas, not necessarily that were affected soil, but that were potentially, that had a chance of being affected, right? And so then within those gray areas, they did, it's hard to see, but those are actually individual, there's like 20 samples within that grid cell where they went out and collected soil samples. So we just took that map and just said, if at some point it was suspected to maybe be affected, let's just avoid that. And so we stayed 500 feet away from those areas as well. And then this is the groundwater. So the orange, yellowy orange hashed areas in the back valley and then in the front valley. Those are the areas where any well had collected a sample, had a concentration of any constituent that exceeded an applicable standard. It was then contained within our area that we're calling the area of affected groundwater. So as you can see, that same buffer exists around those areas of affected groundwater where we're trying to focus in on just those areas that need to be retained as part of the redefined site. So I talked a little bit about what TRC did. We did our own search for records. We contacted the Buncombe County GIS. We searched the state records. We searched the Department of Agriculture, the Tennessee Valley Authority, the Department of Transportation. I mean, we just went through online any place where we could get United States Geological Survey, of course, and anywhere where we could get our hands on some aerial photographs. We did that. And then looked at those areas, and those images ranged from as early as 1900. There's some old USGS topographic maps that dated all the way back to the 1900s. And so we looked at those. And that is all contained in a report that we produced and submitted to the EPA 2013 in May. Then in that effort, we identified areas that were quote-unquote areas of interest. You know, there's a slight disturbance on the aerial photograph in that area. What is that? You know. So then we went out and did 2 different reconnaissance. We did a first reconnaissance in December 2012. As it turned out, after we did the reconnaissance, we got a few more maps in the mail that we didn't think were coming. And so then when we looked at those, we were like, nah, you know, there's a few more things that we need to go back. So we went back out in February and looked at those. And when we went, Altamont accompanied us on the site reconnaissance, just to field verify, put boots on the ground and eyes on what it was there. Is there something there? Any visual sign of disposal? Any visual signs of something that might deserve further investigation, or is there nothing out there? And from that, we learned that there was no new evidence of industrial waste disposal that we discovered that hadn't previously been investigated over the 28 years of all the different people that already looked at it. So that made us confident and felt comfortable that we could say then that the affected portions of the site have been well defined and thoroughly characterized. So in addition to that, like I said, to be overly conservative, we put that buffer around just to give that extra added measure of safety. So the way the numbers work out, the redefined site is 535 acres, and the excluded area is 530 acres. It just worked out that way. I think Rob already talked about the deed restrictions.
Just on that, just so everybody understands, a deed restriction, the reason you put that into a deed instead of us just telling you that, once you put it into the deed, it's part of the property, and so it's there forever. It can't be taken out. Whoever were to own that property in perpetuity would be subject to those restrictions.
And that's it. So that's the final result. So I guess with that, are there other questions that?
Yeah, so at this point, what we're going to do, just so everybody's on the same page, is we're going to go through some of the questions that were submitted earlier, and then after that, we'll go through questions, so we'll open it up to questions for whoever has a question at this point. So we're going to start with those that were submitted in advance, some of which have been answered, so I'm not going to go through the ones that seem like they've been answered, but there are a few that seem like they might not be entirely clear at this point, so I'll try to bring those up again. So the first question that we had in the submitted questions was, how is the land that you seek to have removed from the Superfund site, which would be the excluded area, how is it used when the site was still active?
I think the answer to that is almost all of it was not used at all. When Harry went out and did some of the aerial photographs, some of the things that he saw, there could have been like a farmhouse in some areas. So somebody may have farmed the area and then they went out and looked at that and made sure there was nothing with the farm use. In terms of industrial use, that entire area that we've excluded was not used for industrial purposes at all.
Okay, I think in the past there have been reports or claims that there might have been some munitions testing. Did you find any evidence of anything like that?
No. There was some roadways up that we went and investigated. That was one of the things we were wondering why. We attributed it to maybe the original, like Rob said, there were 2 farm homesteads. There was what appeared to be a dairy farm, because we found like an old milking, not, what would you call it, like stalls. Stanchions, okay, I'm not a dairy farmer, but there were signs of a dairy farm up in this area.
So there were either roads for that, or there could have been fire roads.
Right.
Yeah, still.
Harry, could you go back to the slide that shows the soil sampling?
Yep.
I'll point out something there. You asked about the munitions testing. See how the soil samples extend to the north of that, on the west side, or east, yeah, on the side. And that was a firing range. And so there was, in fact, missiles and test rockets fired into the side of the mountain. And what we found was the northern extent of that firing range when we did the site walkthrough. In fact, we found targets up there, as we have signs, and there were range markers, 100 meters, 200 meters, 300 meters. So that's why that soil sampling was laid out the way that it was. Our understanding in talking with the folks who operated the site was that everything north of that was really just buffer, just unused land, woods. There were a couple of observation towers, one to the northeast and one to the northwest. And some of those roads led up to those. You can find the old foundations of those. So basically, they would have workers sit up in those observation towers and watch the rockets firing in the mountain. But there was no industrial use of those observations.
Another question was, could you explain the evidence you've gathered that the land you seek to remove from the site contains no hazardous materials? So from what we've seen from what we have on our maps as well that we've been provided up until this point, has shown things like, this is a great map to have out there for this question, where are you sampled within that site? Has there been any sampling done in the now to be potentially excluded area that would indicate that there is no contamination up there?
So I guess the answer to that is no, there hasn't been sampling, but the way you would go about an approach at a site like this is you would only sample in areas where there's evidence of some activity. And so that's why all the sampling was done. We kind of know the contours of where there is soil contamination and where there is groundwater contamination after extensive study. We then put a buffer around that. And then on top of that, we went back 100 years with aerial photographs to say, was there any evidence of any other activity up there, or is this just essentially virgin property that was undisturbed by industrial activity? And that's what we confirmed. The only things we saw in those areas are these farm homesteads and observation towers, and that's why they went out and visually observed it. So there really would be no need for sampling in those areas because there's no evidence at all of any industrial activity up there. And we had to find, through all the sampling, the outer boundaries of any of the groundwater impacts and the soil impacts through sampling.
Okay, so there are a few more questions for you all, and then a couple questions for the EPA as well. So would the property owners be receptive to including members of the community or the CAG as it considers long-term plans for the property as these sustainable forestry harvesting plans are developed?
So that's why we're here.
Okay.
We just didn't want to go, you're the neighbors, that we didn't want to go without informing you of what we're doing, why we're doing this. And as I said, if we get to the point where EPA redefines the site boundary, that's the starting of the process. We've already gotten very good names of local forestry consultants. We would interview them, select one of them, and then they would do an assessment of this, and we would then come back and make a presentation to you to say this is what we're proposing to do and get your input when we do that. So we're intending to solicit your input as we go along that process.
Okay. And another more specific question from members says that Buncombe County has an array of economic development, sustainability, and general social needs. Please describe in detail how the Halliburton, Northrop Grumman, and Celanese visions tie into the community vision, and what would the responsible parties, commit to now or by November 1st of next year in terms of a community co-created redevelopment agreements?
Okay, so that was one question I wasn't prepared to answer, to be honest with you. And I don't really have the authority to answer it. You have to go back and talk to the companies. But again, as I said, if we take the excluded area and the redefined site. So we have an idea of what we want to do for the excluded area, which is a very low intensity use. And that's the one I just mentioned. We come back to you. Sustainable forestry on that property. It's really premature on the other parcel. I mean, it's years away because we haven't even selected a remedy for that. We don't know what the remedy is going to entail, how long it's going to take. So to say by November, I don't want to speak, but by November 2014, it's probably premature at that point because we're not even going to be at remedy selection by then, and it's going to be years after that before we get into any considerations of future use of that property.
What about for the redefined excluded area?
I told you, we plan after if EPA makes a positive decision on this, to come back after we've engaged the forestry person to come back and make presentations to the CAG and solicit your input on that.
Okay.
That's our intent.
Okay. So we have a couple questions that were submitted for the EPA. And so I'll ask those, and then I will open the floor up to anybody who has questions for anybody who's here. That could include the CAG board as well, so you're welcome to ask us questions. We'll do the best we can, although we have some of the experts here as well. So for the EPA, what is the timeline and process for considering and deciding on the request to redefine the Superfund site?
All right, I'll take that. Basically, earlier this summer we did get Chemtronics' original submission. We've been reviewing that and concurrently reviewing the draft RI report as well. I asked Rob to provide some, examples of when this may have been done in other instances. So those were provided in September, and in the midst of reviewing those as well, unfortunately we shut down not too long after and are just starting to get rolling again. I would say that there's a technical analysis component. Chemtronics has submitted, its view of, contaminated areas and appropriate buffer. We're reviewing that. We're also reviewing the issue of the regulatory process of how exactly one goes about redefining the site. And so it's sort of a number of issues all being considered at this moment. But I would say, as a best estimate, and this is just an estimate at this point, that probably, about January latest, I think that we would be able to make an opinion on that.
And then the last question that was submitted in advance is, what is the nature and extent of the CAG's authority and influence as you make this decision?
I think Rob's kind of already shared that, and that the PRBs are willing to come back to the CAG and say, these are our thoughts. Once if EPA gives a thumbs up on it, and get input from the CAG.
I believe that question was intended in terms of the decision that the EPA is making about whether or not to allow this process to proceed.
Right. The CAG process, is all about the community being able to have its voice heard, and so we are, all in favor of the CAG commenting, making its views known on the process, and in the final decision. I mean, that's why we're here today, is to listen to y'all. So.
Okay. All right. So at that time, that's all of the questions that were submitted in advance. So. At this point, does anybody have any questions that they would like to bring up? Laura?
We have a critical area where inadequate testing has been done and remediation is still in fairly early stages. I'm very curious as to why so much time, resource, and dollars have gone into reducing the acreage of these 500 acres as opposed to dealing with the core issue here. Because if the core issues are addressed, those what may be called extraneous acres would take care of themselves if in fact there is no toxic substance on them.
So you raise a very good question. I would say, when you said so much time and energy has been on the redefinition, it's this much compared to the examination of the core area. There's been 28 years of extensive study and millions and millions and millions of dollars gone into the evaluation of the nature and extent of contamination on the core area. That, and by the way, that is and still is will be the primary focus, not even close. This is a very recent development. I can tell you it was a thorough review of everything was done, and then a confirmation of that with the aerial photographs and the site reconnaissance that we did, but nothing compared to the intensity of the core area. Now, you asked, I think, a very important question, you know, why don't we just let it sit there and not do anything with it, and when the other parcel gets taken care of? I actually view this as an opportunity to do something positive. It's an area that's not used. It never should have been part of the site. The site was just, to be honest with you, arbitrarily where the property boundaries. It really is not part of the site. After all this investigation, we know what the site should be. And so now we have an opportunity for the community to put this into a preserved use, something that's really low intensity, and that's a good thing. It's very difficult to do that when something's part of a Superfund site. It's very difficult with all the regulations and all the, this is not at all meant to be negative, but the bureaucratic process of dealing with property that's been a Superfund boundary. We can be much more efficient in accomplishing for really everybody what we want to do on the excluded area if it's not part of the Superfund site. If it's part of the Superfund site, that's really, I don't think it'll get done for years and years, and that would be a shame. Because there can be something to make that a preserved, not natural area with sustainable forestry sooner. And I think that's a good thing. But in no way, just so you understand, this is secondary to the primary purpose, which is to properly characterize and remediate the core area.
Right.
Has been and always will be.
And it's my understanding when you talk about millions and millions of dollars, could you just give a rundown of the annual expenditures of the PRPs in the past 3 years on these sites? Because I understand it's in the hundreds of thousands, not millions.
I honestly, I don't have the numbers in front of me, so I don't want to shoot you, but it's not the hundreds of thousands, I can tell you that. Stu probably knows better than I.
Yeah, again, I don't have the exact numbers, but it's the annual operation and maintenance budget, just to keep the site going and sample the groundwater and keep the caps in order. That's in the $200,000 to $300,000 a year range. And the investigation activities have, I don't think they've ever exceeded $1.5 million, even in the most intense activities. So it's not hundreds of millions of dollars a day.
No, I said hundreds of thousands.
Hundreds of thousands. Oh, yes, I said hundreds of millions.
When we're talking about millions of dollars over 28 years,
Yes.
my understanding is it's just
Yes,
$200,000 a year that's being spent in this saga.
Yeah, so the last 3 years of the remedial investigation have probably been in the $500 to $1 million range for the laboratory testing, the drilling, the field sampling activities, and the reporting.
So I saw a hand here, Mark.
So I guess sort of changing the focus a little bit. I don't know if you guys have made any sort of a point to look at health records of the local area, particularly in the Swananoa Valley. There's some opinion publicly that I've just come across by word of mouth, and I don't know about any data that would back up their opinion or would go against their opinion about whether or not health in Swananoa Valley is significantly different than in, let's say, Buncombe County or perhaps region.
I don't know.
Okay. Will that be ever a point of focus for?
Because it's not a component of the remedial investigation.
Okay.
I'm going to ask one question myself, and then I'll get to your question. I'm curious, you mentioned that this would allow the forest to be used in a sustainable way more quickly. My understanding is that at this point, it's sort of held in a natural state because it's within a Superfund boundary, so nobody can go in and do anything to it. So what, from your perspective, is the community benefit to this becoming an excluded area? How would the community benefit?
It's held in a natural state. There's no deed restriction on the property, on that portion of the property. So that's one thing. There's no restriction on the future use of that portion of the property, which we're willing to do. no restriction on the use of the groundwater at that property, which we're willing to do. And on top of that, I am no expert in this, and I do not want to, but my understanding is that if you look at the forest there, there's ways to make it much healthier. That by taking some of the old damaged growth down and replanting, that while it may look very nice and is a good sustainable forest, that it can be improved.
Okay. Would the public, I'm just going to ask a follow-up, and then I've got in the back and Amy's hand. Would the public be able to access that land at any point, or would that be privately managed forest that would be out of bounds for the public?
My understanding is the public accesses it now to some extent. That's my understanding of it. I don't know that for a fact. We really haven't gotten there. That would be something that we would discuss down the road. The one thing that is really important is that we don't have any access to the area that's included, because we don't want to create any risk of exposure to anybody on that parcel. So that would be a paramount concern in making sure that there was no way to get to that portion of the property, because that would not be good for anybody.
Are the PRPs responsible for the water that leaves the property via groundwater or surface runoff?
I don't know what you mean by responsible.
If anything were to happen health-wise or through domestic animals, wildlife?
That's really a legal question, you know, as to legal responsibility. I think the purpose of this investigation is to assess whether that's happened. And I think if you look at the map, the groundwater plumes all within the property at this point.
So it's been sampled outside the property on any other
Yes.
groundwater? Yeah.
So we have Amy.
Oh, right. So suppose EPA approves this, you've got the excluded portion, and then contamination shows up there. Then what?
I think if the property was contaminated, there's nothing that protects us from having to do further investigation on that property. It could be brought back in. There's no, if EPA excludes it, that doesn't bind them in the future from saying, oh, well, we found contamination, it's got to be re-included.
In layman terms, the definition of a site is the extent of contamination.
Right.
So we do find contamination in the exclude zone, then by definition, the site takes water.
And just so you know, this is not something, and Marshall asked this question of us, and he alluded to the fact that we provided this information. This has been done at other sites. The whole concept is that you start with a very broad net when you define the property boundary of a site, and then as you do your investigation, the definition of the site comports to where you find the contamination. And so this has been done many times where the site has been redefined. We're not reinventing the wheel here.
Carol, in the back, do you have a question?
She kind of asked my question. I'm going to wait.
Go ahead.
I have kind of an ancillary question, not dealing specifically with the exclusion issue. And we live in Big Tree Village, right next to the creek and so forth. And we've been hearing for some months on certain weekends, heavy equipment behind us. On Saturdays or Sundays, I mean like odd days, not weekdays, heavy construction equipment on the other side. Is that part of this examination or whatever? What would that be?
I don't know, we haven't been doing any work on weekends. We've been doing work during the week.
There has been drilling.
Yeah, there's been a lot of work during the week.
It's like big
On the
regular
weekends?
earth-moving equipment, that kind of stuff's what it sounds
There
like.
hasn't been anything we
Can't
can do.
see it, fortunately.
And where is it coming from? Where's this coming from?
We live in Big Tree Village.
Can you show us on the map?
But it's probably somewhere around the old Tandy site,
Oh,
So a little farther down, huh?
Down?
you know.
that's down here.
I don't think
Okay,
it's
I'm
us.
sorry. I know it's not exactly what we're talking about here.
No, that's fine.
But we couldn't figure out why they were having major equipment on weekends. Seemed odd.
Not us.
Okay,
Yes.
so a question right here.
What's the classification of the property, be it private or public watershed property?
This is private property. It will
On
still
the-
remain,
Behind the site, that adjoins the site?
oh, behind that,
Correct.
the ridge. I don't know who owns that.
Isn't it state game lands? to the
Could be
north?
state, yeah, state game
And to
land.
the northeast is the
national watershed.
So no, all of the proposed property to be excluded is surrounded by watershed or Pisgah National Game.
It's not adjacent, but Pisgah National Forest is adjacent, the watershed is not.
Right.
So, do you still have a question?
Sorry. I have sort of comment and question. I work for one of the local land trusts in the area, Southern Appalachian Highlands Conservancy. And so I wanted to kind of ask about the deed restrictions that you're referring to, and are you open to considering a conservation easement as a method of applying those deed restrictions? And if so, I have about 100 questions probably that could be asked outside of this, but you know, how would the Superfund process coordinate with the conservation easement?
That's a perfect example where we talked about how it not being part of the Superfund site makes it easier to deal with those issues, because not many land conservation organizations want to have an easement over a Superfund site.
Right.
Okay, so that's, to be honest, we haven't gotten to that point yet. That's something that we would discuss, but that's a perfect illustration of why doing something like this and preserving it is much easier and much more plausible when it's not part of a Superfund site.
Sure.
So we will get to that point, hopefully, at some point, if we get this part, and then we see that there's some way to do some conservation work on the property. That's one of the things that we would certainly discuss. I'm glad you brought that up, because that's a very good example of why just leaving it there at the Superfund site may not be the best way to do it.
Right, and I guess I would
And
just...
you're right, look, I've been the head of my local land conservation organization. I know all about that, all these issues, and so that's an important aspect of this.
Okay, and I would just say that the sooner that, you know, we like starting the discussion early on, before, you know, you're saying, okay, we're ready to close on an easement. We like talking about it, you know, in advance. So.
And again, this is certainly going to be an iterative process. The first step is to make sure that EPA is comfortable with this and that they feel technically and procedurally that we can do it. If we get to that point, then we're going to start the process of what's a good conservation use for the property. We even hired a consultant to go out there and assess that in any detail, and then we can engage in that process of discussion.
So, question for Lily, and then we'll go back to the back.
This conservation part, the deed restriction and the forestry improvement, is that all part of your request for the redefinition?
No. So we asked for the redefinition. We told them that this is what our intent is, but we haven't, to be honest with you, done the detailed work with the forestry consultant to make sure that it makes sense. But I can tell you this, whatever it is, it's going to be some conservation use. There's not any intent to have any intensity use on that property. No residential, no commercial use. It's going to be a low-intensity conservation type use. We think that the most sensible is forestry because it's a forest. But if for some reason that were not to work, we would look at some other low-intensity conservation type use.
And someone in the back,
Just,
and then...
can I do a follow-up on? So just to be clear on what's included in the boundary definition request and what's not, are the proposed deed restrictions on residential use and water use included as
Yes.
a part of the boundary redefinition?
Yes.
Okay.
That's what I was getting
That's
at.
what you're asking, yes, that's in the package. We committed to that up front.
Okay.
The ultimate use, the conservation use, we couldn't commit to that because we haven't done the study for that yet to make sure that that's the appropriate conservation use. But no residential, no potable groundwater use on that parcel.
Are people's pets or wildlife at risk if they're drinking from the creek?
That's a technical question. The answer is no, but
No.
it's really a technical question.
The surface water sample has been sampled, it's routinely sampled. It's fine.
This might be more of a question for the EPA, but so if it was discovered or determined that something was going on in this acreage and it had already been excluded, and let's say, you know, they were driving out these roads into some of this unaffected acreage and dumping stuff or burying waste or whatever, and that was determined. and it had already been deeded over to a forest conservation group and/or a conservation easement somewhere, and let's say it wasn't even contiguous, where the activity was taking place, it was off, what would be the process that you would actually have to go through to bring that property back into the Superfund site? How would that work, and how long would it take, and so on?
Maybe, if we were to find out maybe that there was soil contamination in an area that had been excluded.
Yeah, that you didn't know that some kind of activity was going on that was contaminating the soil.
We would have authority just under circle, under the implementing statute that, basically Chemtronics and the other PRPs have been doing their work. We would have authority under that statute to respond anew to that issue. And so that's how that would be dealt with.
To expand the scope of the work that they're required to do.
Right.
I mean, it's in the agreement that they signed already.
So it could just very quickly be brought back into the Superfund site?
So it would still be part of the Superfund site per se, yeah. We would just say this is part of the site.
That's an important point. If you actually look at the definition of the term, the site is defined by where the contamination comes to be located. And that's why this redefinition is trying to define the site where the contamination is located. So if there were contamination that was found in the excluded parcel, that becomes the definition of a portion of the site.
So I think this is a follow-up to that. Am I right to assume that if, for some odd reason, we found contamination outside, totally outside, maybe on that ridge to the right, would that then be considered part of the Superfund site? Or
I think they have the authority to come back in and require
so it's just
action for
any
that.
land either within the boundaries or outside. Okay, that makes sense.
Okay. Go ahead, Jerry.
Thank you. I'm one of the members. I have a couple of questions. On the deed restriction, residential can mean a lot of definition to it. Residential don't just mean a certain type of person. It can be to the elderly, to the children, or you can't have so many on a piece of property or whatever. So I don't think just stating residential as a deed restriction satisfies any.
To me, residential would include.
That's what I'm talking about. Excuse me for interrupting. I'm wanting to see the actual definition of what residential is, because it's a broad term.
Okay, so to me, residential, and we would obviously have to have specific language that everybody would agree to, but residential means anybody living there in any way, okay? It typically also includes, for purposes of EPA's definition of residential, it's more expansive than just people living there in any way. It would be things like you couldn't have a school there. Trying to think of other examples of things that EPA considers a residential use. Residential meaning people living there for a certain period.
Can you have a greenway on it?
Excuse me?
A greenway?
Like walking?
Walking?
I don't think that's considered residential use.
Yeah.
That's not considered residential use.
Okay.
And by the way, there's people walking on there now from what I understand.
Well, yeah. Well, there's a part about the timber that she brought up, the old forestry. We don't have too much old forestry left nowhere. I think for the tax purposes, it wouldn't be a benefit, but a one-time use to take the timber off. But the old timber would be certainly a great thing for the community. If you was to use it for a low density something, it would be a beautiful thing to do. So I'd consider that, or ask you to consider that. The other thing is, if there's any testing, I know of other contaminated sites where tree forestry can't be put on because of contamination. So has there been any kind of testing done on the forestry outside of the contaminated site to see if the trees might have contamination related to anything?
No. The answer is
it's
no.
Not been tested.
Okay.
The other question is...
All right, Gary, I'll give you one more, but then we need to move on to other people who've been waiting.
Well, I've not taken up 3 or 4 times coming back. I'm just going to say mine, let's move on. There's not been any satisfactory concern about the lagoon, the big one, the big three plumes and all talked about tonight, but my understanding is that there's no bottom in them. It's just the dirt, and they're covered over. So the water and chemicals that's coming in there, my understanding is there's no ground. It's just ground. It's not concrete and nothing like that.
People can answer that, but that's really not the issue tonight, because that's all in the included parcel.
Well,
We're talking
I
about
think
all in
it's the
the
reason we are
included
here. But my concern is that, why are there not a bottom in it so that it's not absorbing into earth? Now, you can answer that tonight or later, but the other big question
Okay,
for...
Jerry, I'm going to stop you there because we've got other people waiting. So can anybody speak to that question right now?
That's the purpose of the remedial investigation, is to define where things are. It's been defined, and so with respect to some reports refer to it as the acid pits. I think you're referring to it as the big lagoon in the back valley. That's one of the disposal areas that is covered, and that following the RI will be the feasibility study where it will be addressed. So that has yet to be addressed.
Okay.
It will be, yes. Does that answer your question?
That answers. I got one more though for you.
Okay, well, we'll come back around. We're going to give everybody a chance. Go.
Okay, so
I'm going to sit down if you don't mind.
Please do, please do.
yeah, a couple of questions for the EPA. So while we're looking at where the appropriate boundary is given the contamination, the map that you showed earlier shows the groundwater contamination areas coming right up to the boundary down here. If up is north, it would be to the south.
Can we potentially put that slide back on? Is that possible?
And down at the south end.
What are you excited?
The groundwater slide? Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah. So, so my question is, while we're looking at what the appropriate boundary is, as a part of this request, will EPA also look at the potential need to establish more of a buffer in those areas where the gold hashed region comes right up to the site boundary?
Not actually expand the site down there?
Yeah.
It's at the Big Tree Road.
So there was a lot of discussion about the advisability of having a buffer, and so I'm just asking if EPA will be looking at the possibility of establishing a buffer at those two areas of the site boundary.
The quick answer is probably no, because that's private property that's owned by private individuals, and we have to get their permission to do something like that.
And I'll just say,
I'm sorry, just one second. Sure. But I thought the statute gave you the authority to require action on anybody's property, whether it's privately held or whatever, if there's a potential for risk or harm.
Can I answer one part of this? Because I think we're flipping here what we were doing with the buffer. So the site is defined, okay, as it currently is, and the site as it currently defined incorporates all areas that have been impacted by the site. What we were trying to do was to make sure if we were excluding any area, that there was no chance that any of the excluded area is going to be impacted. And so it's really a separate question. You don't need to expand the site because the site is really defined as everywhere where the contamination is located, and we've defined that to be within the current boundaries. On the other side, what we did was, if we're going to have an excluded area, we just wanted to be safe and sure with a buffer that there was no impacted. So they're kind of like an apple and an orange.
Right, and so I know this is not germane to your, to what you were going to do with establishing the buffer on the north end, but over the time that the site's been under investigation, the plumes have moved. And so I'm just asking, does the EPA not have the authority to look at the advancement over time and decide whether it would be appropriate to establish
That
a
we do,
buffer?
and we felt that we needed to expand the groundwater monitoring system, put additional groundwater well, monitoring wells out there, yes, we do have that authority.
Okay. Yeah, and if we found that the contamination had in fact crept off-site at some point in the future, obviously, we would seek to address that as well.
Okay, so don't let me put words in your mouth, but it sounds like what you're saying is that the time to address that question would be when we talk about the remedial investigation report and what it's showing in terms of the monitoring.
Correct.
Okay.
I'd just like to ask a point of clarification here on this. So does that mean that there are now additional groundwater monitoring sites potentially here and here that are off property okay, so there could be contamination here, we just have no idea of testing it?
No, we have wells that are at the property boundary that are
Okay.
clean.
So
So we're confident
okay.
that the plume is on the property. There is no reason at this point to believe that the plume is off the property because we have clean wells that define the edge of the plume.
Okay.
And so what you're asking as far as potentially expanding the property in that direction would be a point of concern if you didn't have clean wells, but we do. Does that make sense?
Laura?
From that very thin line, the Superfund as a risk-driven program is, and this is for you, Harry, because you referred to applicable standards.
Right.
Are you referring to applicable Superfund standards in which the risk is 1 out of a population of 10,000, or the normal standard of risk of 1 person out of a population of 1 million?
Okay. So the standards that I'm referring to would be published values. So it's not a risk. The way that the published values are arrived at are using risk calculations, right? But once they use those risk calculations and they decide that 5 micrograms per liter, right, or 5 parts per billion is anything that exceeds that particular value for a certain compound, like trichloroethylene, for example, then that would be, it's published. And so what we did was we looked at all of the published values, the federal drinking water standards, the state drinking water standards, right? And then took the lowest of the published values to be most protective. And those are what we're calling the applicable standards.
So you would be, just to clarify, so you would say if something is measuring below that standard, it would be considered clean?
Correct.
Any other questions?
But not outside of those boundaries.
It is clean outside. Right. That boundary defines inside exceeds those values.
There's wells that are sampled for those standards at the boundary of the property, the downgrading boundary, and they are clean. They are below standards.
Below
the most stringent applicable standard under any federal or state law.
NCLs.
Yeah.
Two standards.
Or 2 of them.
Yeah.
In some cases, the 2 wells are lower than those. Yeah.
I think one thing that might help clear it up for all of us who are sort of looking at that map and seeing that it looks awfully close is, can you give us an idea of what is the closest well that's showing contamination to the boundary? How far are we talking that contaminated well is from the boundary?
I think part of this is we're starting to creep into the discussion of the remedial investigation.
Yeah.
And I hope to be back to talk about that in great detail with a lot more clear maps focused in on the property boundary, different plume maps for different chemicals, because which well has which contamination really depends on what compound you're looking at. So not trying to punt this yet, but we're still in exchange of comments on the RI report. And I think, John, you said earlier, maybe by January we could be back. So hopefully we'll be back to be able to answer all of these questions about what's where in soil and groundwater and surface water in great detail. But the focus of tonight's discussion is hopefully going to be on the concept of redefining.
Just to make them, if you really want to know, grab yourself a CD, because all those maps that show that are in this document.
Yeah, that detailed data is in the draft remedial investigation. The draft remedial investigation is posted to the website of the Swananoa Superfund CAG. You can get it there. The technical memorandum that was written by TRC in support of this request to change the boundaries is also on the website of the Swananoa Superfund CAG. So that material is there, available for you to see.
All right, so a bunch of hands go up, so Bill first, and then we'll go Laura and Mark, and then back to Gary.
Yeah, just to take it back to the boundary redefinition work that you did. So one of the things that you look at is the operational records. And we've heard, I've only been in the area for a few years, but we've heard discussion from people who've lived in the area for a long, long time about all the work that went on at the site, and at the time the site was shut down, boxes and boxes and boxes of records. So what I don't know, maybe you can help me with, is how did you find the completeness of the operational records that you were looking at? Were there really detailed records of day by day, here are the activities that took place over all the years on the site, and what kind of condition were those in?
Let me clarify that. TRC didn't look at the operational records, and we didn't interview any employees. I was pointing out that the operational records in the 1980s and the early 2000s, there were different episodes of where employees were interviewed. And throughout the course of doing the early studies, there was extensive work on looking at the operational records, but I didn't personally. Those records are, I think, in Houston now.
So as we developed the work plan for the remedial investigation and feasibility study, that was in 2010, I think, that we published that work plan. Leading up to that, probably 18 months in advance of that, all three of the companies went through their records, reviewed the operational history, went interviewed former employees. We interviewed some former employees here in town, and we built all of that into the work plan. And volume 2 of the work plan, which I'm pretty sure is here at the repository at Warren Wilson, contains a description of each one of the areas, all those little gray boxes that were on that map that Harry showed earlier. So each one of those operational areas has the operational history talked about it. It has a map that shows the outline of the building and shows the building penetrations and sewers and sumps and those kinds of things. It also talks about what the building was used for, talked about inspections that were done while the buildings were still in operation in the early 90s, and then goes back even further in the operational history. So all of that information was in the work plan, which was then used to develop the sampling program, which was the first phase of the remedial investigation. Once those data came forward, then 2 additional phases of investigation were completed based on the results from the first phase. And all of that's in the remedial investigation report, which is on that CD, and we can talk about here in a few weeks. So the point is that there was a lot of work done in building the work plan, and that's all documented.
I know Jerry's my role model, so excuse me. I have just a couple of questions. Who are the PRP's EPA representatives? Your primary contacts with EPA?
John is the RPM and Marshall's the attorney, so those are the 2 primary contacts.
I'm going to say this on the record, and I thought long and hard about this before making a public statement, but from the get-go, this CAG has experienced Region 4 EPA liaison representation that ranged from woefully inadequate to just downright bizarre. And I think it really has put a barrier in terms of what we as a CAG feel that we can do and should do. And it seems to me that at some point, we need to be dealing with all of the stakeholders around the table and getting past the EPA filters, with all due respect, and the corporate filters, and what is the right thing to do here and get on with it. And I understand that may sound naive, but I passed naive about 30 years ago, and, you know, this has gone on a long time. And I think if you would take that message back to your corporate employers, that we really do not want to go the route of CTS CAG. But it's always a possibility. And we would really like to see some forward movement here rather than retreat.
I think that's why we came here today.
Yeah, and I appreciate your being here, and because it's a hard thing to do. It's a hard thing to do, because we have a mess in our backyard, and you're here to explain how the mess is going to be dealt with at some point.
Yeah, on behalf of EPA, I mean, you know, this is the first time that we're ever speaking, but you know, I'd be interested in talking with you later and finding examples, what you mean by, you know, you don't feel like your concerns are being addressed, whatever this bizarre behavior is that's going on. I'm not sure, and you know, maybe you know we can talk about it later. I'd be interested in hearing who you've spoken with, and you know how your concerns are not being addressed. But you know, on behalf of Region 4, I mean, we are here to address your concerns and the CAG's concerns. We take this very seriously.
I think that there have been some phone calls that have, that individually people can share with you. And Jerry has recordings of Region 4 representative addressing groups. You might want to take a good look at it.
Sure, yeah. I mean, you know, maybe you can let me know later who that might be, because I'm not sure who it is you may be talking with.
Okay. So I've got you on the list, Vicki, in my head. Mark, you had a question?
I'm not sure if I just missed Amy's comment, but I was hoping maybe that the CAG could get a copy of this presentation and we can put it on our website.
Sure.
Yep. No problem. Fantastic. Thank you.
Great, Jerry, that brings us
And
to you.
Mark, there's a lot of, what's already on the website has a lot more detail in it. The full submittal that we made to EPA on this. So each one of those slides is a summary of a lot of information. So for example, all the historical aerial photographs that we went through are in that submittal. So this is a good start. It's good to have it on there, but if anybody really wants the backup information with all the detail, you already have that.
It's on the website, yeah.
Yes.
It's some of it's tedious, but like,
Sure.
if you want to go back and look at the
Yeah.
historical aerial photographs, it's a good thing, you know, it's there.
Yeah, this is just a 10-second elevator speech that I can give to locals. And
It's no problem.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Jerry?
Thank you. You did a great job on your presentation in regards to what you gathered as data. But there's one point that you didn't say, and it's each at me, and I've said it many times at our meetings, and no answer has come. Halliburton is a very well-known company that has a lot of technology, but I don't think it's been used, and if I'm speaking out of turn, you tell me. You've talked about all kinds of topographical maps from the 1900s forward, but no one has mentioned the penetrating radar system that they've got, that they can identify anything they want to underground that is metal. And I'd like to know if that has been done or can be done, and is it willing to be done by the PRP in the future before you ever consider going further with this property thing, so that we can identify for sure if there's any tractor and trailer loads of stuff in the mountains or in the valleys or missiles somewhere, things of that nature.
Sure. To answer your question, there have been a number of different geophysical or remote sensing techniques utilized in the investigation of the site. There have been magnetic, conductive, EM34 is a tool that's used for identifying metal objects in the subsurface that you referred to. There was a EM34 survey done of Stu, help me out, it was the target, what's the name of the target area where?
Well, we refer that as the target area, and then also we did a survey, geophysical survey of the acid pit itself, under the acid pit cap.
So, yeah, go ahead.
There had been a subsidence of that acid pit cap about 4 years ago, and we wanted to see if there was metal debris under there that might be rusting out and collapsing. So we did a full geophysical survey of that cap and found some metal.
I'm speaking of the whole boundary, not just one or two specific spots. So could you let us know where those maps are and what specifics you're talking to rather than just verbally? Could you have us something we could look at? Because, I mean, you're talking technical.
Right.
If we had a map to show what you're talking about, it would help us to understand as citizens that you've done this area, but you ain't done that area.
Yeah, those documents are available in the repository, I believe, and we can verify that. And then we could even send to you the date and title of the reports that I'm referring to so that you could go and view them in the repository.
And let me just follow up one thing, because I think it's important. I know we focus a lot on the aerial photographs. There's a reason that those are important, because if there was areas where things were disposed of, or where there were pits in the area where things were disposed of, you would see some evidence of disturbance on the aerial photographs over time. You would see some change in the topography over time. And so you use that as your first line to determine where there could be areas where there were disturbances. And as Harry said, we did find areas of disturbance in the excluded area. It just happened that those areas were a dairy farm or a home or things like that. They had nothing to do with industrial activity.
But my question really...
I understand your question. In addition to that, you would then go and say, okay, are there any areas where we think there was suspected burial of metal material, drum material, whatever? There was some of that investigation done as well. But you just don't, on a 500-acre piece of property, go out and do, ground penetrating radar over an entire 500 acres. There has to be some underlying basis to say, that area looked like it could have been used. It could be the witness testimony, it could be the aerial photographs, and we went through all of that to investigate any possible area that was industrially used, and then we investigated it with the aerial photographs, and then we went out and visually observed it, and in some areas, some of the things that you've identified were done as well. So all of that, in an iterative process, was done. Was every square inch of the 530 areas done with ground penetrating radar, or I don't even know what the EM number is? No. But you wouldn't do that. No investigation would do that, because you can't go over every square inch. You have to have some basis to look in that area. And any place where we had any information where we thought there could have been some kind of impact, we investigated.
Ground penetrating radar is a very useful tool to see the subsurface, what's below the ground, down to a certain depth, depending on the density of the material of the soils, right? But like Rob said, so if we were out and did our reconnaissance and discovered a mound or a big bowl, and we went, wow, I wonder what that is, that would be perhaps the next step, would be to do some type of remote sensing technique, or you just go out with a backhoe and you
The bottom line to my question is, how much have you done on the penetrating to find that? How much acreage compared to what has not been done? Because I think there's a lot of ifs, ands, and buts about a lot of these roads in the mountains, what it might have led to at some point in time. Nobody knows. So that's the reason I'd like to see the bottom line, because it don't sound like we're getting to the root of what I'm asking.
Well, I'm sorry if you feel that way, because I'm here before you today to say that my professional opinion is we poured through all available, like Rob said, aerial photographs, and that, as a scientist, that's what you do, is you look to see, is there evidence that causes you reason to want to investigate something further. And we really didn't discover anything in an area that hadn't already been investigated. That's our conclusion.
I have two people on the list, and then but before that, I'm going to ask one question of my own. As a scientist as well, I have a PhD in biology, so I'm experienced with sampling techniques. I'm curious if, for the sake of alleviating potential concerns for the community, if Altamont or anybody on site at the PRPs would be willing to do some random testing in that excluded area in order to, although I understand it's outside of the boundaries of what you think is contaminated, in order to provide some alleviation to the community and do some soil testing or groundwater testing in order to just say, this, we're going above and beyond and we're gonna look at it.
My answer to that, and this is not meant to be at all flip, is you only do that if there's any underlying information which leads you to sample, because you wouldn't even know where to sample. As you said, it would be random. We systematically looked at all of the investigation of this property, which went over 28 years, and then on top of that, went through the process on the rest of the property to make sure we didn't miss anything in 3 or 4 different ways, and then to do sampling randomly on top of that, on top of the ridge where the groundwater is up gradient of any contamination, and to be poking for soil where there's no indication in any of the records or anything we've looked at. It really, it doesn't make any technical sense to do that. It really doesn't.
From my perspective as a scientist,
if you did that and we didn't find anything, you could just as easily said, well, you didn't look over here either, and
Sure.
that would be just as valid. So any place where we thought there was even a shred of evidence, documentary, aerial photographs, operationally, interview of employees, scientifically based upon groundwater flow direction, use of the property, we've investigated. And so to just randomly say we're going to do more doesn't make any scientific sense. It just doesn't.
Just a brief follow-up question.
I would like to follow up with my own question, actually, before you
All right, is that accurate?
Yeah, completely.
I would like to do my own follow-up on that, and then I'd be happy to let you follow up with my follow-up. And then I swear I'm getting to you guys, I promise. So I guess from my perspective, as a scientist, you don't know it's not there until you've sampled it. And I certainly, as a biologist, we certainly do that in terms of species range and things like that, where we said this is the farthest extent of the range, but we perhaps should look somewhere else, even though we really don't think it's there. And I'm not saying that I am contesting at all your professional opinion. I respect your guys' professional opinion. I'm asking from the perspective of alleviating community concern. Because there is, I'm hearing, and I've heard in the past as the chair of the CAG, that there's considerable community concern. And while it may not be a technical concern, it might go a long ways as a good faith effort to indicate that you are willing to take those community concerns, and even if you don't think they are scientifically valid, perhaps from your testing mechanism, to go ahead and go that extra mile. That, I will leave it at that from my perspective, but I am putting that forward as a potential good faith effort. So I'm going to let Laura follow up, and then I really am going to move on to the back over here. I saw Vicki had hand up a while ago, and I've seen your hand, so you're getting tired of it.
And I'm not necessarily looking at
I'm getting to
quantifiable answer to this question, but to follow up with Jessa, in your investigation of the 28 years of investigation, how many instances did you find that you determined would warrant additional examination? And of that number, how many were actually examined further?
Okay, so how many areas did we identify that were warranted further investigation?
That's right.
So we looked at the aerial photographs and identified a series of, and again, this is all in our technical memorandum, so you have a copy of this. We identified, I would just say, a dozen, maybe 20 different areas, right, where there was a road or a clearing or a level area.
Or a structure.
Or a structure, right? And we went out and, or there was all of a sudden, trees were cleared, where they were present on one photograph. There was a new clearing that showed up on the next. And again, this is all focusing on the area that's going to be excluded, right? So, or there was a series of roads. Why were those roads there, right? And it wasn't just me doing this. We also have a PhD biologist who was actually, I think, and Rob is also, he's a PhD geologist.
He's not a PhD, he just acts like it.
Oh, Rob, maybe. He just
acts
like it.
I can attest to that.
Okay, so we have 12 to 20 areas defined within the 500 acres. And how many of those of the 12 to 20 areas?
So we went to each one. We went to each and every one of those.
Okay.
Right, and took photographs. There's photographs in the report of those areas. And, didn't find anything that there was evidence of, didn't find any evidence of burial, that things might have been buried there. Wasn't any mounding. Didn't find anything that made us think, hey, we should do some further investigation of this, right? What we found was there's a remnant of a chimney from the original house structure. There's 2 homes. There was a pipe. We decided that it was a stove pipe left over from the stove. There's a photograph of the stove pipe. So we've checked each and every one of those areas and concluded that there really wasn't anything that deserved further concern.
But with eyes, boots on ground, just looking, taking
Correct.
photographs.
That's right.
That's it.
That's right.
Okay.
So I want to move on to Vicki and then Melody, and then I'll get to you as well.
We got 10 minutes, 11 minutes.
Okay, well, I want to explain that my position as a researcher on this. I am a scientist too, and I've read those documents, and I think they're really good.
Thank you.
I think it is clear that I cannot imagine how you could have done it better. And I also want to,
Thank you very much. It's not what I expected you to say.
Well, I want to add that the fact, I have been going to these meetings since the 80s. John had hair. They have not kept us in the dark. They have done their very best to interact with the community. And in my opinion, throughout this, and I own property almost adjacent to this. So, in my opinion, they're doing a good job.
Thank you.
And Stu, I think they are extraordinary professionals. If that helps anybody.
Well, my original question was not asked tonight, and I sat here very quiet. So I appreciate you guys not bringing forth my question and representing the whole entire community. I also appreciate all of you guys being here to talk to the community, to share with us all these things. I know it's late, and I don't know what part of the country you guys are all coming in. So I just want to say thank you for coming here.
Philadelphia, Pennsylvania.
Wonderful. I live less than a mile from here. When I hear, and I just want to throw this out there, when I hear sustainable forestry, I feel like there couldn't be anything more sustainable than the forest that's already sitting there. When I hear sustainable forestry in the same context as these companies, all I think is genetically modified forests. And I know that we've had plenty of meetings. They've had a recent meeting around here about this. Can you?
That's not what we're talking about. And in fact, again, I don't want to get ahead of ourselves. We're going to hire professionals from this area. We've already gotten the resumes for 3 or 4 of them, all of them highly qualified and recommended. It may be that they say that the appropriate thing to maintain the forest out there is to do nothing and to preserve it in the state that it is. I can't prejudge that. I'm not an expert in that area. We are going to hire an expert from this area who tells us what's the best way to maintain that forest. That's the first thing that we're going to do. So you may be right. They may say, we need to cut down some of the timber in that area to make this thrive and replant. And that's the kind of thing that we would share with you before we went ahead and did it. But we're not there yet. That's, I would say, the third phase. The first phase would be to get approval from the agency. The second phase would be to hire the consultant. The third phase would be for the consultant to go out there and actually do an assessment. The fourth phase would be based upon that assessment to make some recommendations and get input about doing that. The fifth phase may be dealing with, and I understand this contact may happen earlier, how do we preserve that in perpetuity with the appropriate easement on the property? That's all down the road. So, I hope that answers your question. We are trying to do the right thing with that property. And having it part of a Superfund site makes it more difficult to do the right thing with that portion of the property.
And I mean, as a business woman myself, like, I understand that if there's an aspect that could bring money in to pay these property taxes, because the expenses are so high to maintain it. Like, I get that, but following up with just, like, as good faith to the community, just, that's, I don't know, not doing anything with it would be what would be like that thank you community for us coming in and doing all of this bad stuff for all these years. And I just think it would, any action that's taken on that property is going to be suspect to so much scrutiny that I just don't think it's.
And by the way?
From the PRP's point of view, I don't think that would be something that I would want to even tackle, you know?
Well, just to respond to that, that may be where we end up. But even properly preserving that property is more difficult.
As a Superfund, I get that. Mm-hmm.
And that may be where we end up. That the best thing to do is just to preserve the property. But we haven't done the investigation, and as you can see, we don't just jump to the conclusion. We're pretty darn thorough in terms of even defining what this area would be. We've presented something to EPA. We're going through the process with the EPA. We're not going to jump ahead to the end point. We're going to take this step by step and end up with the right result.
I'm not a scientist, and this is not really a question, it's a statement. I agree with what Jessica said about doing further testing on the property. When you were speaking as a rebuttal to another person's question, you got your words a little confused in saying invest and investigate. We as a community are worth the investment for all the testing to ensure that we're safe and the property adjacent around is all safe. And I don't think it's an investigation statement, we need investment from you all to make sure this is done right, in a timely manner, and correctly.
What's our time?
5 minutes.
Okay, so we've got
Not that
5
we have to use them all, but.
We can get out 1 minute early, which I think is our record.
Yeah.
Does anybody else have any questions or comments they'd like to make at this time?
Just to be devil's advocate, are we talking like 2 samples? What would help the public be comfortable? 3 samples? I mean, that you kind of need to know what you're thinking in that regard.
You know, I certainly think that a number has not been discussed at any of our meetings, so
Take a transect approach.
But, you know, I would be thrilled to see a good faith effort of, you know, a number of some, I mean, even if it was 10 that were actually done and could show, like, look, no contamination here, no contamination here, no contamination here. And I understand all the sampling procedures. I really do. What I'm speaking from is there is concern within the community, and it might be worthwhile simply to alleviate that concern to put some time and effort towards that.
We as a community are worth the investment.
I understand, I do understand, I understand exactly what you're saying. We're trying to do this in a scientific way. I think that was really the gist of John's question as well. And understand that if we had not come forward with this proposal, which was really to create a win-win situation where we could take this and do something that would make sense for the community, we wouldn't be sampling in that area at all. We wouldn't have even done the investigation that we've already undertaken, because the agency's already determined that that area the areas where sampling has to occur.
Maybe we should ask the community to tell us where they want to sample, and then we get happy.
Well, there still has to be a scientific justification for it.
If I may, I'm also not a scientist, but I did see that you guys did a very thorough investigation of previous employees. Were local or surrounding neighbors or people who, I mean, these are fantastically beautiful mountain ridges, and we got a lot of truckers back here, you know. And so I don't know if they do anything stupid on their time up in the mountains. So I don't know if it would be an easy way to sort of track that or look into that sort of a thing. Were neighbors or people who live close by included in those?
We didn't do the employee interviews. That was done in the 80s and early 2000s. We didn't do those interviews, but they were done as part of this repetitive investigations over the years. We didn't do that investigation.
Right. Okay.
So I don't know who else was talked to in the community when they were done. Neither Harry and I were involved in this at that time.
Sure.
We're getting a 2-minute warning.
My
Oh, that got
terrible-
people excited.
my terrible
All right, I
expires.
got Jerry and then
The secretary packs up and leaves.
It is the technology that I've talked about, the best technology out there. Has it been put to use on this property?
What you're referring to, the ground penetrating radar, is typically used to identify things that are shallow. What I know has been used at the site has been seismic, and the seismic study conducted where they were trying to identify the top of bedrock, and then there was various studies where they looked using the EM34, like I said, as a conductivity. So I'm not aware of a GPR survey. GPR is used when you're trying to find shallow things, like in the upper 6 feet or the upper 3 feet. So do you know if any GPR has been done? Right. It's not a cutting edge. It's a useful tool. It's a useful sensing tool for finding things in shallow subsurface.
Well, I'm using that terminology because I'm not an expert in the area. I used it for an example.
Okay.
And so my concern is,
Yes.
how deep can you get the new technology to go to find things that might be buried deeper than just, when you say shallow, are you talking about 10 foot, 30 foot, 50 foot? What are you speaking of when you say that term?
It depends on the density of the soil and the specific technique that you're using. Stu, you said it was used for what was used for the acid pit investigation?
The equipment we use is all tow behind, on the ground equipment.
Well, I was speaking to his aerial stuff, not your ground operation, because
If something was
I'm
buried
speaking
at
to...
50 feet out in that area,
Do what?
if something was buried at 30 or 50 feet out in that back area, the disturbance would have showed up on the aerial photograph.
I'm not talking about disturbance, I'm talking about the new technology. Has it been used? And I don't hear it being used.
I guess what I'm saying to you is, you would use the technology to determine whether something had been buried out there. If something was disturbed, it would show up on the aerial photographs.
I can understand it from your perspective as an attorney, but as a research person, I would say if they use this technology, they might find something, but as an attorney, they would tell them to go as shallow as they could instead of going to the best. I can understand a lawyer.
Yeah, but Rob is correct that if there was a reason to believe, you wouldn't use a remote sensing technique like ground penetrating radar unless there was a reason that caused you had reason to suspect something was buried there. And so we didn't find anything that caused that suspicion.
I think we're covering ground.
Yep, so we're gonna move on to Vicky's.
I was wondering if we ought to start making plans for the next meeting, and maybe hopefully inviting to hear more about the draft RI and the feasibility study.
We will certainly do that, but are there any other questions or comments on what we're talking about today? Okay, so we have regular standing meetings as the CAG, so we will get to that, Laura.
Just on a lighter note, from the aerial photographs, if you're from the south, you know if you want to bury something, bury it shallow, plants and kudzu, and in 10 days, you will never see it.
We should be looking for kudzu.
That's right, we gotta look for kudzu.
All right, then.
All right, so I think we're out of time. I do want to say thank you very much to the representatives who came today. We really appreciate I can stick around for a few more minutes, and I will stick around if anybody has any concerns they want to talk to me about. But thank you, everybody who did come here, and if you're not on the mailing list, we would love to have you at future meetings as well.
There's CDs from us. You want one more?
Please, it's going.
Oh, there they are.